Welcome to episode 6. I'm thrilled to introduce our special guest today. Her name is Professor Coleman. She is a theology professor here at Assumption. Her expertise is in metaphysics, philosophy of nature, and philosophical anthropology. I think you're going to want to listen to this one through. She's a critical thinker, and we're going to have some great discussion. Let's do it. Well, Professor, thank you for coming in. We really appreciate it. How's your morning been? What's your morning routine like? It's 9:30. I've never recorded in the morning, so.
I generally get up pretty early and, read, pray, take a walk outside. So,
Nice.
Before I get to campus. So,
Cool.
it's pretty chill.
I see you have tea. This morning I went to Taze. I did my routine. I left Taze, and I usually get tea when I leave, right? And I put it on my the top of my car this morning, before I came to the media center. Somehow, I had my keys in my right hand, and I placed the cup of tea on the top of my car, and I guess my keys lassoed the tea bag. Yeah, and it just exploded. So that was funny. So I don't have tea.
I have once done something similar, and coffee went all over my windshield. So,
right. Oh, that's awesome. Worse than tea. Right. We only have so much time, and there's many things I want to cover. Let's get into it. So my first question, I guess we'll start something broad. I was going to ask you, why do students at Assumption not like theology? But I think the people that don't like theology are just the ones that don't necessarily try to like it. I think a better question is, why do the students that maybe don't like it, why do they condemn theology?
Well, I mean, that's pretty complicated. I mean, I would say that mostly people don't know what theology actually is, number one. And then I think a lot of students and even the broader campus community think that what theology is basically students being indoctrinated or catechized into the theology of the Catholic Church, which, I wouldn't... that's not what theology is, number one. But number two, it is sort of interesting that people come to a Catholic university and then don't expect to ever have to interact with Catholic doctrine, Catholic theology, Catholic thought. That's still a puzzle to me.
Or that it would be a bad thing if they did.
Why that is the case, yes, exactly.
Right.
People don't really know what theology is. I have to say, when I entered undergrad, my undergrad was a place called DeSales University in Pennsylvania, and it's very similar to Assumption. And so when I started, I also didn't know what theology was in undergrad. And very grateful, I didn't know what philosophy was either.
Right.
And so very gratefully, I had really good professors who helped me understand. Theology is, literally, right, it's theos logos, right, the study of or the logic of God. But Catholic theology in particular is about understanding not just God or doctrines about God, but sort of how we come to understand God. And that I think a lot of times people seem to think that, and there's a lot of historical reasons for this, but people seem to think that knowing God is a matter of what we might call blind faith.
Right.
You just have to believe in God and that's it. And so that's why they think that theology is just catechesis, basically. Here's a bunch of doctrines you have to memorize.
Let me convince you to say that you believe in God.
Yeah, something like that. Anybody who's ever taken my class knows that that's not what theology actually is. What it actually is sort of how can we come to understand what this world a lot better. So in that sense, it's actually, it's different from philosophy. Philosophy and theology are distinct from each other, and yet, right, they often sort of coalesce on similar topics.
Right.
And there's a reason for that, because both are trying to understand the world much more deeply than we sort of perhaps might first under our first impressions of it.
So whereas theology has a transcendental kind of clear, maybe it's not very clear, I guess. Of course, God is not clear, but philosophy is, it seems like the chase of something that you can't reach, while theology is the pursuit of something you possibly can?
I don't know. I mean, like, it depends on who you sort of take your understanding of philosophy from, right? What philosophy is.
That's true. Right.
I take it generally from, and the Catholic Church does too, right? The Catholic Church takes up the Greek tradition
Right.
Almost immediately in its history, right? Which should indicate something to us, right? Like this pre-Christian tradition of knowing reality, right, that has nothing to do with Jesus Christ,
Right.
is something that Catholic theologians have almost immediately taken up within what it means to know God, right? So that's not true of every religion, actually, right? And so I think sometimes people need to, people don't think about that enough, that phenomenon enough. Why did sort of early, what we would call the early church fathers, right?
Yeah.
The sort of first people who really started thinking about like what all this means, right? This,
people that came after Christ or people before Christ?
I mean,
Jewish people?
so if you look at the Gospel of John, for example, there's already a lot of Greek philosophy within the Gospel of John, right?
Okay.
The Gospel of John opens up with, right, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was made flesh. He's using logos there. It's written in Greek, right? That's straight from Stoic philosophy, right?
Okay, wow.
And so we should ask why that's the case, right? And so, I mean, the answer that I have is that Catholic theology is always concerned with, right, at sort of Jesus's own word. He said, "I'm the way, the truth, and the life," right? And if truth really is real, right, then any access to it, right, is going to lead you to God, right? If God is truth, if Jesus Christ is truth, right, then any sort of pathway to that.
I see.
And so
Greek mythology, Greek philosophy concerned with the truth. Right?
Greek philosophy is concerned with the truth, right? And so I would say, to go back to your earlier question, right, the way that I understand philosophy is not just simply asking questions, but asking questions in pursuit of truth, right?
Okay.
And I do think truth to be transcendent, right? It is something
Right,
that...
it is, yeah.
Yeah, it is something that transcends, right, all human beings, right? If that's the case, then that's why Catholic theology takes up Greek philosophy immediately,
Okay.
right? And sees no competition between the two, actually, right? That philosophy and theology are in pursuit of a similar goal.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
I wrote this question down. I didn't want to ask you, but now I think I need to. And the question is Socrates a Christian prophet?
Ah, that's funny.
I think I might write my thesis on that. Might have to just write my thesis.
Yeah. So right now we have Pope Francis. The previous pope who just died was Pope Benedict XVI.
Right,
And
okay.
when he was he? I think he was Pope. I think he was Pope when he wrote this. He wrote that actually. He says that Socrates is a prophet of Jesus Christ.
Wow.
So
that's
you're
awesome.
not without.
Let's go.
You're not without precedent.
Let's go.
So I think the way a lot of both Catholic philosophers and Catholic theologians understand Socrates is, and Plato too, actually, right, is that because they were, both of them were, and Aristotle as well, but especially Socrates and Plato, because they were both so insistent on seeking what was true, right? They sort of couldn't help but get close to like certain realities about God, right? Really interestingly, probably Plato's most sort of famous student, other than Aristotle, was a philosopher named Plotinus, and he was what we call a Neoplatonist philosopher, right?
Okay.
And he wrote a series of works called the Aeneads, and in it, it's very interesting. Plotinus has a sort of triune understanding of the good and what comes from the good, and like he gets very close to a triune understanding of God. It's not quite there, but
meaning like a three-part, like a trinity, essentially.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, wow.
Like, and again, like it's not quite on the same level as Christian understanding of the Trinity, but it's very interesting, like somebody who is not Christian, somebody who's just sort of studying and thinking about the works of Plato gets very, very close to that.
Right.
Yeah.
Wow.
So,
Okay.
yeah. So, I mean, I don't want to simply baptize Socrates. I don't think that's fair.
Okay, all right.
And I think that some Catholic philosophers and theologians do that, and I'm not sure that's fair to Socrates.
Okay.
To be honest.
Right. Yeah.
But like, even in the Phaedo, for example, where Socrates is giving his understanding of heaven, and of course, like there's 1,000 different interpretations of not heaven, the afterlife. There's 1,000 different interpretations of what that could actually mean, right? What he's doing in the Phaedo. But if you take him somewhat seriously about his understanding of the afterlife, it's clear in the Phaedo, he's on his deathbed essentially, meaning like not that he's going to die from sickness, but he's literally like on his bed going to drink the hemlock. And he still is very clear that he's not entirely sure, right? Like that he's not completely sure that this is going to happen. And so he's hopeful. In the Credo he says, either, I think it's both in the Apology and the Credo, like, either death is like the best sleep you've ever had in your life, right? Or like I get to meet like the heroes and the gods and things like that, right? So I think he's fairly clear that he's not positive something's going to happen.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's why I would say I don't think it's fair to simply baptize Socrates.
All right. No, that's
but
fair.
I do. Again, you are not without precedent.
Okay, that's very interesting.
No less a theologian than Benedict XVI has called Socrates the prophet of Jesus Christ. So.
Okay, well, let's go back to contemporary Catholicism, and I kind of have almost a gripe with it because of my upbringing and kind of, I'd say, what's happened to me. So I went to CCD for, I think, 6 to 8 years. I started when I was 8 or so. I got confirmed when I was 14. And to me now, there seems like there was something wrong with it because I didn't learn things that I think I should have learned. I didn't learn the difference between denominations. I didn't learn the difference between... I didn't know that... I guess I might have known that Jesus was a Jew, but I didn't really know what that meant. And it seemed like CCD... And I know we're young, and I guess we can only handle so much truth, but it seemed like they were like, you're a Catholic, nothing else matters, almost,
right.
Which is upsetting. And it's... Because then it's like they're hiding the truth from me.
Right.
And I went through that process, and now I'm kind of in a confusing state where I don't know what to pursue. And I think a lot of students, specifically probably students at Assumption, have gone through that similar process. I guess kind of what was CCD up to? Did they just were they just doing what the parents needed them to do?
Yeah, I can't answer for CCD.
Like, nothing? Were they up to nothing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, let me, if you don't mind, I'm going to sort of like broaden your question a little bit.
No, please do.
Okay.
Please do.
So I think that a lot of, and again, like this, your experience is not dissimilar to mine, right? Like, I was not always Catholic, and I fell away for a long time. And which I think a lot of my students are very surprised to hear, because I think they kind of think it's like just a brainwashing cult, basically. Exactly. So the fact that I sort of like was convinced by something is surprising to people, right? But I think that the church has not done a good job, and there are a lot of reasons for this, and both the church's fault and sort of not the church's fault, but the church has not done a good job of what we would call catechesis. And catechesis, again, I think sometimes people think catechesis is just like memorizing doctrine or something like that. Bad version of catechesis. Catechesis, technically speaking, would be sort of like having people understand like why the church believes and holds what it holds, basically. And so sending students to a religion class for an hour a week, right, for, I don't know, like 30 weeks of a year, right?
Yeah,
is not really going to cut it, right? So Catholicism, now this differs from theology. I mean, obviously, sort of like the religion and the theology overlap ultimately, but Catholicism is not simply a bullet point list of things you have to do, but that's often how it gets taught, it seems to me.
A to-do list, that's what I wrote down.
Yeah.
That's what it felt like.
Yeah. Rather, it is a whole sort of understanding of how God and the world relate to each other and what that means for human life, right? That's a very different picture than most people get in sort of religion classes. Even if they did go to a Catholic grade school or high school, they don't often get that picture of things. I do think that the church has failed in a lot of ways. There's a lot of reasons for that, but one of the reasons I could say is the church sort of relied on the culture for a really long time. So what I mean by that is you just by living in sort of a Christian culture, you got a lot of what it meant to be a Christian, right? That's not the case anymore. I don't think we live in a Christian culture anymore. We're post-Christian, both in Western Europe and in America. A lot of people might have some issues with me saying that, but I really do think it's true.
Right.
If we now live in a post-Christian culture, there are certain aspects of our world that still retain like the memory of Christianity, but no sense of why or how it got there, right? So for example, like that all humans should be equal in dignity, I think that's a Christian concept, right? That comes from Christianity. But everybody takes that for granted now. Nobody knows where it came from, right? So this is what I mean about we still retain the memory of what it means to be a Christian culture, some of it, but we don't know why or how we got there. And so I think the Catholic Church in particular is still grappling with the fact that we're no longer a Christian culture and like how to educate people in light of that, right? Because you could rely for a long time on just the structures of the culture teaching people what it meant to be a Christian.
You could trust children's parents and their grandparents
yes,
and their surroundings.
Exactly. And that's really not the case anymore.
It's not, okay. So that 1 hour, I mean, it has to be 1 hour because it seems like it can't really be too much more just because people are busy. But then the 1 hour can't possibly be enough. And it's not even the environment of the 1 hour is also wrong, it seems.
I think so. I think that, to sort of steelman the CCD, like what it was for, right? Like to be fair. I don't think CCD was ever supposed to teach students or kids all about what it was to be Catholic.
Right.
CCD was supposed to be, here are like the finer points of Catholic doctrine that you might not get in your family life. But CCD was never supposed to be carrying the weight of what it means to be Catholic. In fact, the family is supposed to do that, right? And so think about it this way, like if you lived in a Catholic family and like your family, sort of the overwhelming culture of your family was sort of structurally Catholic, then you go to CCD and you just like learn these kind of like, oh, we think about that way and we understand that way. It just kind of like tops it off, for example.
Okay, right.
But like if, and I'm not sort of projecting anything about your family situation, but if parents just sort of like...
Yeah, I was thinking about my dad.
I'm going to get in trouble. He's my friend. But if parents just sort of send their kids to CCD and it's totally divorced from anything else in their life, it's of course going to seem totally extrinsic and basically nonsensical, right?
Yeah.
So I want to like, I mean, I don't think the church has done a great job, but and I don't think the church has quite come to terms with what it means to not exist in a Catholic culture or in a Christian culture anymore, which is interesting because that obviously the church came out of a non-Christian culture. So we once knew how to deal with this, right? We once knew how to do this, but we don't anymore. We had about 1,000 years.
It got easier, right?
Yes,
so, yeah.
we had about 1,000 years
Fair
where
enough,
it was,
I mean.
and so the church is still grappling with this.
Yeah.
But what CCD was actually for was again the Christian culture.
Okay.
It wasn't supposed to be making up for everything.
That helps. I understand that. And there's also the problem. Well, there's that problem that you just explained, but then I'm 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Like, how can I understand that? What it even means for something to be transcendental? I thought Cartoon Network was transcendental. They're like
well, I know what you mean, but I actually would disagree with you, right? If I think children are more perceptive than we give them credit for, right? And open and receptive. And so I think kids have an imagination, and when one communicates to them appropriately that there is like sort of someone looking out for you and everyone else too, right? They start to get it intuitively.
Okay.
But if you don't grow up with any concept of that, right? If you don't have any sense that there's anything more than the world around you, right? Then it becomes more difficult to understand what transcendent could possibly mean, right? But there's a reason, for example, like J.R.R. Tolkien, right? Like the author of like The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings and stuff like that, right? He's a Catholic, right? And Lewis is a Christian, right? C.S. Lewis is a Christian. He's an Anglican, and he wrote the Chronicles of Narnia, right? Their books are, Lewis's in particular, the Chronicles of Narnia, are aimed for small children, right? And they get them, and they get that there's something sort of above and beyond going on there, right? That it's not just this world, or another way to put it is that what we see is not the only thing in this world. Right. Interestingly, sort of pre-Christianity, everybody had a sense of that, right? Like, we just have to look at sort of the traditional myths and cultures, the myths and belief system of the traditional cultures of the world. Nobody thought it was just this. Right. Everybody had a sense of something else is going on here, right? And so one of the interesting questions, and in my intro class we talk about this a little bit, is how do we get from that to where we are now, where most people don't think that there's sort of anything to reality other than what we can sort of immediately see, feel, and touch, right? So
is that metaphysics? Things we can't see, feel, and touch?
So that's my specialty is metaphysics, right? So which, like, most people think when they hear that, they think it means I'm a witch, which is not the case.
I didn't think that, to be fair.
So, well, Barnes & Noble has like a metaphysics section, and it's all like Wicca and stuff like that.
Okay,
yeah, so, cool. No, metaphysics is an area of both philosophy and theology. In a certain way, it's actually where philosophy and theology meet, I think, is sometimes how I describe it. But metaphysics is an area of sort of, technically, as Aristotle defines it, it's the study of being as being, right? But what do we mean by that, right? Being means like you exist and I exist and this table exists, right? So everything on earth has something in common, that it all exists. So what can we say, right? How is that possible? What can we say? How does that relate to, does this desk exist differently than I do, right? Do I exist differently than you do, right? This is the study of metaphysics. And literally it just means after or above or beyond the physics, right? So like you're studying like physical reality and then above and beyond physical reality. We get the word from Aristotle actually, and in a sort of a Catholic metaphysics in particular, which is what I do, a lot of the questions come down to like how does God how does the being of God and the being of the world relate? Okay. And that's what I do in particular. Okay. We don't cover that a lot in my classes. It's a little
graduate school class maybe?
Yeah.
So Spencer couldn't be here. He has a game today. He's actually starting. It's at 3. I'm going to go to the game. But he one question that he asked me, and I think he wanted to ask you, was he phrased it something like, why should I practice? Like he wanted me to tell him, and I wouldn't even say I necessarily practice Catholicism or Christianity in any sense, but he was like, I want someone to tell me why I should practice. Like, why should I add it to my day-to-day? And I think my answer was something like, well, you have to figure that out on your own. Like, no one can tell you. Is there a better answer? Is there a better, how would you approach someone with that kind of mindset?
Yeah,
Not that it's a bad mindset, just that it's a mindset.
Well, I would start with saying that if we want to do anything well, we have to practice it, right? Like whether it's playing an instrument or playing a sport or, right? Like you cannot just sort of become good at something without constantly doing it, right? And so, you hear this phrase a lot, how do people put it? Oh yeah, I'm spiritual, not religious, right? People put that a lot, say that a lot, which makes me always laugh. I always say the opposite. I'm religious and not spiritual, mostly because I think the sentence is sort of ridiculous, to be honest. because this idea that one can have a relationship with that which is beyond you, right? So transcendently beyond you, without a practice of something is a little bit silly, right? Like we would say, anybody who you love, right, or who you want to have a relationship, you have to, as we like to put the work in, right? Like, like if you think of a significant other, right, if you wanted to have a relationship with that person, a really healthy one, right, it wouldn't just be like, oh, like, when I feel like it, we can have a relationship, or when I feel like it, I can call you up, and no other time, right? Like you have to like be with that person actually, and do the work of the relationship. Now, we're not, I mean, here we're not just talking about another human being, but we're talking about sort of that which is so transcendently beyond that we have a hard time sort of understanding what God really is and means. Now, and so in order to be in relationship with him, right, then and sort of understand one's life as given by God, right? It seems to be, and all the implications that means, it seems to me that a practice, right, would be necessary, just like it would be for any sort of relationship between two human beings, right? And so there's a writer named Annie Dillard who I really love. She was brought up atheist and then ended up converting to Catholicism, and one of the ways she puts practicing, right, religion, and obviously in particular Catholicism, is she says, you know, if you want to go see the stars, right, if you want to go see the Milky Way, especially in our modern world, you have to like drive up to a remote mountain, right, and put yourself in the position, right, of actually seeing the stars, right? The stars, right, now it's not a perfect analogy, but the stars cannot sort of change what they are, right? You have to change your situation.
Right, the stars won't come to you.
In order to see them, right? Similar with God, right? Like you have to change your situation, right, in order to have, right, the best relationship possible with him.
Right. It reminds me of the fact that you almost have to be open to, maybe not being a slave, but being open to servitude to something, because that reminds me of the masses that Ortega y Gasset talks about, and I brought that up on the last episode, and that the excellent man, like almost, in my read, I saw that the excellent man almost has chains, whereas the mass man doesn't, but the chains that the excellent man has is to something greater than its own being. So then, because of those chains, they're not actually bad; they're actually good.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what your question is pointing at is what is freedom actually, right?
Yeah.
And is freedom like this, just the ability to simply follow one's like basest instincts at any point in time, right? I think that's what we think that freedom is often, right? Like I just get to do whatever the hell I want at any point, right? But I use this example in my class a lot, but like think about it this way, right? Like who is freer, right? The student who knows that he has work to do, right? Has a paper due a week from now, right? And like has the discipline to sit down and like do the work, right? So that the night before the paper is due, he's not freaking the hell out, right? And so he sits down a week beforehand, and every sort of night for 5 nights or something like that, he works on this paper, right? So on the one hand, he's not free, because he's not quote unquote free if to like follow his desires to like watch Netflix that night, right? But who's actually freer, right? The student who like has that discipline, right? Or the student who like every night just, and again, like I'm speaking just out of personal experience here, right? Like every night like decides to watch Netflix until the night before the paper is due, and then feels horrible, doesn't know what's going on in class, right? Who's the freer person there, actually, right? I think it's the former. It's the one who actually has discipline, right? And so like when Aristotle's talking about a virtuous or a magnanimous man, right? Like magnanimous would be sort of one step up from the virtuous man, right? He's saying that it's the person who knows how to integrate and submit his desires to the good that he actually wants, right? Versus the immediate good of like just the sort of base pleasure of like zoning out in front of a show, right?
Okay.
The good that we actually want, right, requires discipline. And I don't care if that's God or like even just like getting an A in a class, right? It always requires discipline. So freedom can't be just following, right, base desires immediately, right? Satisfaction. But I think that's how we think of freedom often.
Or if that is what it is, then I don't want freedom. And no one really should then want freedom to that extent.
But I would say that's not freedom, right? Like the student who's freaking out, 8 hours before a paper is due and is probably going to get
a worse grade,
a C or a D, doesn't seem to be very free, actually.
Because they might have had more free time, but those free hours, those like 10 extra free hours they had, they didn't actually lead to a more free life, right? Yeah. So that's interesting.
Yeah.
I think that is a good answer. We kind of drifted away from Spencer's question, but we had to. We can move on to the next section here, and I'll probably rotate back and ask some other questions. Has religion been demonized in our society? Demonized is a strong word, but...
Yeah, I think in particular...
I guess particular Christianity.
Yeah, I think in particular Christianity, although not limited to, but I think precisely because we are shaped by Christianity, like the foundations of our culture are mostly shaped by Christianity. So even those of us who are not Christian live in a culture, if you're in America or if you're in Western Europe in particular, you live in a culture that has been shaped by Christianity, right? Yep. And so it is not surprising to me that then there would be reactions against that. It's also, in America in particular, this is less so in Europe, but in America in particular, you have denominations of Christianity that are incredibly sort of contramundum, meaning like look for divisive issues, right? And sort of almost pick fights, right? I mean, I think that fights have to be fought sometimes, but so what I mean by that is, so for example, like we live in New England, right? Founded by the Puritans, right? Yep. The Puritans' understanding of Christianity is not one that, I mean, it's not one that I agree with, like, at all for various reasons. And it's one that rejects the sacramentality of creation, which means that it's very, very suspicious of the material world and the body in particular, right? So certain things in Puritanism get really demonized, right? Like sexual desire, any desire whatsoever gets really, is very suspicious, right? And that attitude also it tends to get picked up by what we would call fundamentalist Christianity, right? Fundamentalist meaning, right, you sort of read the Bible as if it's all like reporting from the New York Times or something like that, which is not how one is supposed to read the Bible. And so again, fundamentalist Christianity also rejects the sacramentality of creation and therefore leads to a kind of suspicion of the body.
What is the sacrament of creation?
Yeah, hold on for 1 second.
Sorry,
suspicion of the body and suspicion of like desire and things like that, right? And so what I think one of the problems is with those types of Christianities is that they're very anti-human ultimately, right? Like if you are suspicious of the body, you're suspicious of desire. It's just desire, right? That's a very anti-human stance, right? Like desire is a human quality, right? I mean, again, going all the way back to Plato, right? Plato talks about this all the time, which is one of the reasons I love Plato, right? And so if you take an anti-human stance, ultimately somebody's going to react against it, right? I think. So that's one of the reasons. So sacramentality of creation, what I mean by that is, so in Catholicism, we have what we call the sacraments, right? Sacraments, baptism, the Holy Eucharist, confirmation, there's more. But what we mean by sacraments are points at which, right, God's grace is definitively, meaning we know for sure, communicated, right, in and through this action, right? The sacrament of baptism, the Holy Eucharist, et cetera, right? Well, the thing is, what that means more broadly speaking, right, is that God and the world are not antithetical to each other, right? If God is willing to sort of communicate himself in and through the material world, which is what the sacraments say, right? Like in baptism, you are basically in and through the water of baptism, God's grace like comes to rest on a person, right? So what that means is that God is not like against the world. In fact, God wants to communicate himself in and through material reality. And that would mean then that everything in the world, right, has the capacity, right, on some level to communicate who and what God is, actually, right? Which is, so if you deny that that's possible, right? If you deny that it's possible that the material world can communicate who and what God is, right? Then ultimately your stance becomes God against the world, right?
Wow, okay.
And rather than, and so like it becomes a very antagonistic relationship.
Right, which is contradictory because if God created the world, why would he be against it?
I agree.
Right.
But I mean, one of the reasons for that is Protestant Christianity tends to take original sin and say that original sin just it totally wrecked everything to the point of it cannot sort of be redeemed, essentially, right? Whereas Catholicism says original sin wounded us and it wounded nature, but it did not destroy it, right? And so God can still use nature to communicate himself, all right, so that he can be known in and through nature,
right, okay.
Which is again why, right, why the early church fathers immediately took up Greek philosophy, right? Because Greek philosophy was about knowing the transcendent in and through the world, right? And so the early church fathers have no problem with that whatsoever, right? But if you think that we're totally sort of like if the world was and nature itself was totally sort of ruined by the sin of man, right? Then God has to essentially replace nature, right? God has to sort of like overtake it rather than work with it to allow himself to be known.
So is that something? So is that maybe where I think it was Montesquieu? I could be confused, but is that why he thought that in a state of nature we're just at war with each other because of original sin?
Yes,
because God.
Right. So I mean, I think Montesquieu and Locke and Hobbes are somewhat influenced by a kind of Protestant understanding of what that means, right? They would say that the state of nature is it's kind of interesting. Like in Catholic thought, we would say the original state of nature before original sin was actually sort of like this kind of, we would call it prelapsarian perfect man, right? And then we kind of wounded ourselves by sinning, and that wounded nature. It didn't ruin it, but Protestant understanding is it actually ruins nature, and so yes, we are totally at war with ourselves all of the time. There's no possibility for sort of goodness to be known or come about, right?
And Locke thought this as well.
Locke, I think, yeah. So, I mean, I'm not a early modern scholar at all, but I think Locke takes Hobbes, and Hobbes definitely thought it. He's very explicit about it.
Right. Maybe I was thinking about Hobbes then.
Yeah, Hobbes is very explicit about it. And then Locke, I think, sort of takes Hobbes and is like, we gotta make this like less aggressive, basically.
Hobbes. That's what I was thinking. Okay, that's what I was thinking about. He was the one who said that we were constantly in a state of war, in a state of nature.
Yeah.
Right, okay.
Yeah. And therefore we need these kind of laws to keep us in check and all of our desires in check and everything.
Right.
Yeah.
And where did he think, I don't know if you may not know this as you just said, but where did he think religion came? Did he think religion was necessary, or was it just that we entered into the social contract and society for those laws?
Yeah. So again, I'm not an early modern scholar, but as I understand Locke, right, religion is sort of helpful in keeping people in check, but it doesn't really have anything to say about like the nature of reality.
Okay.
So it's sort of like if you like this, that's great, right? And it might be helpful to keep those kind of like passions in check. But it doesn't say anything ultimate about human being, about reality, about, right, the world in general. Yeah.
Okay. So I guess, how did Catholicism kind of in a non-Puritan sense reemerge in America?
Well, I mean, it's been here for a long time, right? I mean, well, in New England, Catholics weren't allowed for a while, but like Maryland, for example, right? Like, and the reason I say it like that is because the state was named after the Virgin Mary, right?
I was
like,
gonna say, did you say
yeah,
Maryland?
yeah, Maryland, right? Like
Cool.
that, like we say Maryland, but like the state was named for the Virgin Mary, right? Like that, it was a Catholic bastion for a really long time, right? So Catholics have been here for a long time, especially on the West Coast, right? Like that's where a lot of the Spaniards, I mean, most of California's cities are named after saints, right? Like San Francisco, St. Francis, right? Like Santa Barbara, St. Barbara, cool. et cetera, right? So, and then there is, as soon as sort of the New World was discovered, a lot of religious orders were like, oh my gosh, we have to, like, because we didn't know that these people over here existed, right? And so a lot of religious orders were fairly keen on coming over and sort of like spreading the good news. So the Jesuits in particular, right, were very, and they were an order mostly based in Spain. So a lot of Jesuits came over, and there are a lot of what we would call the North American martyrs, because they sort of reached out to people, and you know, for various reasons, some of them were killed for their beliefs. So the Catholicism's been here from the beginning, but it hasn't. I don't think it ever like took hold in the same way. A lot of the founders of the country were fairly skeptical of Catholics, right? Like they called Catholics papists, right? Meaning like the Pope, right? And
it wasn't very popular at the time.
No, or at least it wasn't popular within the founders, right? And the reason for that, I think, is something we should still pay attention to personally, which is the founders were skeptical of anyone whose last allegiance would not be to America, but in fact to something other than America, right? And so, right, that's why they called us papists. Now, I would say my last allegiance is not to the Pope, but like insofar as the Pope sort of represents the church, right? And the church is, as we say, right, the bride of Christ, right? Yes. But, right, I think the founders were not wrong to be somewhat suspicious, because if your last allegiance is not to America, right, then there are going to be some things that America does, right, that you may disagree with, right? So there's been a tension, I think, from the beginning of the country.
Right, and there's had to have been, I guess, or the founders thought there had to have been.
Yeah.
It was almost like this kind of attitude was inevitable. I mean, I thought about this because seems like every TV show I watch, if the show is not about the church and like the church comes into it, they're always just super corrupt and like eat people or something. And like, that was in The Last of Us. That's why I say that. But that was a spoiler. But yeah, that's why I kind of bring this up, because I think that's kind of funny.
I mean, the church, like, I don't want to, there's a English author from like, I think he's 19th or 20th century, Hilaire Belloc. And Belloc was Catholic, and he I'm going to butcher the quote, but it basically said something like, he said, I'm bound by knowing what's true and good and beautiful to practice Catholicism and have my allegiance to the church, right? But, right, basically, if that weren't the case, right, those who run it would sort of like prove that it would sort of make us very, very suspicious of it, right? I mean, it's interesting, all the way back in the 4th century, St. Augustine, right? I mean, who obviously influences Assumption, right? So we're talking now 1600 years ago, right? Yep. Augustine basically wrote, one of the proofs for the church's reality and like that it's true is that I'm sort of glossing Augustine's words here, but the idiots who run this thing, right, like should have run it into the ground already, and yet it still exists, right? That was 1600 years ago. That's funny. Right? So there's something
and
to be
arguably gotten worse.
Well, I mean, yes and no, right? Like, I don't know. But, like, corruption and fallibility exists in every age, right? Yeah, like, it is, I do find that logic somewhat compelling. Like, what institution has lasted this long?
Yeah, that's right.
right, that's been run so poorly, right? The only thing that sort of comes close, I think, at this point is the Roman Empire, right? But even that, right, started to degrade fairly quickly at the end, right?
Right.
So when I was coming back in the church and I was sort of studying things, wondering where I stood and everything, that was a fairly compelling piece of evidence for me, right? How does this thing still exist, actually, given all of the problems that it has, right? So...
And it's funny, Augustine's awesome. I like his, I think the Confessions are great. I wish they gave that book to us as a freshman, first year, and I just kind of threw it in the desk. Never looked at it, but then I read it in Rome last semester, and it was great. I liked his kind of like honest progress from different things from, I forget what he practiced, that weird...
Manichaeism.
Right, and then he found Greek philosophy, and then it led him into Catholicism, which is really cool. Let's move on. We're running out of time, but so this podcast is kind of in part a testimony to me and Spencer's like love for philosophy, or kind of that was influenced by assumption. And we have philosophy on the one hand, which I see as the pursuit of the truth, and a pillar of that is asking questions and having an elastic mind. And then there's kind of religion on the other hand, which seems to me to be the most important thing, and I guess we'll say Christianity again, is faith, where you have to kind of have a faith that you don't question things. Is there a contradiction there? And if so, like, how do you work through that?
Yeah, so the short answer is no, there's no contradiction.
Okay. Cool.
But let me sort of go back to one of your premises, right, which I would sort of alter slightly. It's in the Catholic religion, right, in particular, right, faith is not the ultimate, right? It is faith and reason always together, right? This is, again, like something anybody who's taken intro with me, and if they listen to this, they'll like probably laugh, right? Because it is not supposed to be just faith, right? It is supposed to be faith and reason, always together, right? And so faith without reason, excuse me, becomes very, very blind to everything, right? Because you're sort of like, I don't need anything else, right? I don't need to sort of understand anything, really. I just need to sort of say that I believe in this. But my question is always faith without, if you have a faith without reason, what does it mean to believe in something, actually, right? I really don't understand what it means to believe in something without understanding it on some level and constantly trying to understand it ever more, right? It's very superficial.
And that requires reason to constantly understand it more.
Right? It's very, very superficial. Alternatively, I would say reason without faith becomes very, very, very narrow, right? And what I mean by that, and I'm not making this up, this comes from G.K. Chesterton, among others, but faith without reason, reason without faith, right, sort of can't get out of bed in the morning. So what I mean by that is you are always operating on some principle of faith, right? So for example, right, number one for reason to work well is that the structure of reality, right, is meant for you to understand it, and you are meant for reality itself, right? If you put that into question, which some people do, right, then you become sort of trapped in your own brain, right? Like you can't, it's hard for you to like sort of get outside of yourself, right? So Chesterton says that the man who has only reason but no faith whatsoever, right, tends to think that, tends to go kind of insane.
Nihilistic,
actually.
Maybe even.
Well, no, just goes a bit insane, right? Because how can I ever tell that anything in reality is sort of revealing itself to me truly, right? That's a tough world to live in, right? I believe that reality, right, can tell me about itself, right? In fact, so I started out, I was a bio major in college. I still love biology, right? I have a BS in biology, right? The entire scientific project is built upon, right? This faith that the world can tell me about itself, right? That I can understand the world, right? We take that for granted, and we should on some level, right? But actually there's a faith involved there, right? So for our reason to work at all, I think that we have to have a faith in reality, right? Okay, so once you make that step, right? That there's a faith, then I start to like really discover reality and understand reality, right? And it like, for example, like causes, right? That I start to see that everything that I encounter has come from something else, right? Nothing has like popped into existence on its own, right? And then I'm like, well, wait a second. Like if everything has a cause, well, that means that at some point there had to have been a first cause, right? Where does that what is that first cause, right? Where does that come from? That's both faith and reason working together, right?
Because you use your reason to decipher that something needs a
exactly
effect or
cause.
Okay.
Like so I would say that they're faith and reason are in harmony, right? And anybody who says otherwise, like I especially when it comes to sort of Catholic theology or philosophy, like I would sort of really balk and reject that premise. The other
it's
thing
a dangerous premise, kind of.
Yes. Why do you think that?
Well, I think it's dangerous because then you could justify terrorism with your faith in God. I mean, I think that's maybe what terrorists may do. So that's just one tangible example.
So I would say that they always work hand in hand, and faith without reason is sort of empty, right? And reason without faith, right, kind of can't get outside of your own head, actually. And then the other thing I would say is, right, we again, I think we operate on principles of faith way more than we think we do, right? So for example, like I think you would agree black holes exist, right? They're a thing that exists out there. Have I ever seen one or encountered one myself? No. Right? But in order for me to like think about the prospect, right, I have to sort of like assent to the fact that like people who have told me these things exist actually like are not lying to me and telling me the truth, right? So, and then I'm able to sort of think about like, well, what does that mean, like black holes existing, and like how does that affect sort of the nature of our reality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So there is a principle of faith there, right? An operation of faith that you then sort of use reason to check on, right? This similar thing, I mean, it's analogous with God, right? Sure, I think I'm fairly certain God does exist. In fact, I've staked my life on it pretty completely, right? But what, I mean, okay, so then like, what does that mean? What does that mean that, what does that mean for how I live my life, right? What does that mean for how I interact with other people? What does that mean for how that, like, I approach the rest of reality, right? You see how they're always at work together?
Something like I'm trying to do some rigorous physical training, and I have faith that if I do the right exercises, I'll strengthen the muscles I want to, and I'll get bigger and stronger. But then I also use my reason to adjust the workouts, and I like make them better based on the information I have and the experience I have, right? Okay, so can kind of work in anything or anything good.
I think so. Yeah. I think that the two are always at work. I think it is a human principle. It's not just a principle of religion, but a human principle that faith and reason are always at work together.
And then another dangerous, I just remembered, Euthyphro is has a dangerous attitude towards kind of just having faith and not using reason, which I find very interesting. Just to answer your question again, the reason I brought up faith and I kind of assumed faith was the most important pillar of Christianity was because of the story of Abraham. It's in Genesis, I think 21, 22, 23, and he, if you don't know the story, he's basically, God tells him to go to this mountain and kill his only son Isaac, who he waited over 100 years to have, and he's willing to do it, and then God sends an angel and tells him to stop. And it didn't seem like there he was using reason and he was only using faith. So is Abraham is he maybe a warning to people instead of a idol?
Yeah, I would say a couple of things about that story in Genesis. So it's number one, the way that that most of the Old Testament makes the most sense to me is only in light of the revelation of Jesus Christ, right? So Jesus, as you mentioned earlier, is in fact Jewish, right? Which means he knew the scriptures inside and out, right? And what Jesus is constantly saying in the Gospels is that he is the fulfillment of the scriptures, right? And so things that did not make sense to the Jews, right, in their own scriptures, right, only make sense in the light of Jesus Christ.
Right.
So that I could see if you just look at that story alone, what in the world is this about, right? Like, I mean, this looks a little bit terrifying, right? But in the light of Jesus, right, it opens up the meaning of that story, right? Which is that God sends his only son to actually be sacrificed, right? The Father sends his son to be sacrificed, right? So there is this, what we would call a type, right, in the Old Testament. And only in light of Jesus does what happened between Abraham and Isaac and God become very clear, like what was going on. This was a foreshadowing of what God himself was going to be doing, right? He didn't actually ask Abraham to do it ultimately, right? But he himself goes through with it. The Father sends his son, right, to be sacrificed. The other thing I would say about that story is I think sometimes we... it's not simply that our reason goes away, right? Like Abraham had been already given, like things had been asked of him and been told to him that he literally like didn't think was going to happen, right? So like he was told that he was going to have a son, and Sarah laughed, right? And like he was like, it's not possible. And then it happened, right? So his reason is at work in that story, right? That like I've been promised something and it came true, and I thought it was impossible, right? So, think about it this way, like if like one of your friends tells you something, right? And then his promise comes true, one that you actually think is impossible, right? It's not then unreasonable to listen to him a little bit more carefully, even if he tells you another thing that seems outrageous. Crazy, right? So, okay, right. Yeah, and then the last thing I'll say about that is...
And that's reason.
Right? And then the last thing I'll say about that story in particular, and again, I'm sure that both Jewish and Christian scripture scholars have a lot more to say about it, is... I think sometimes it can be the case that God asks us things of us, right, that we don't understand at the beginning, and then we understand later why, right? And so, for example, like maybe Abraham didn't yet know what it meant to submit fully to God, and then once he did, what was going to be given, right? But again, like he'd already been given things, right? That he thought was kind of crazy or impossible, and then I don't think it's totally unreasonable to then listen a little bit more carefully once that promise has been fulfilled, right? But what it seems to me, one of the things that was given there is Abraham himself like then understood how much faith he actually had in God, right? So but yeah, that story is not without there's a lot to think about in that story, for sure.
And it's not that Abraham never questions God, right? Because doesn't God say he's gonna kill everyone in Gomorrah?
Sodom and Gomorrah, he argues with him, right?
Yeah, right. Okay.
Which is that's really interesting. Like whoever the Genesis author was, like what a weird thing to have your patriarch questioning God, right? Arguing with God. Again, like I think we need to pay a little bit more attention about both Judaism and Christianity have a lot of back and forth with God, right? A lot of it, right? And so this idea that it is sort of like simply authoritarian, it's just that the scriptures themselves don't prove that out. It seems to me.
And it's not simply about faith because it's not simply authoritarian. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
I think this is a good place to end.
All right.
I think we had some great discussion. Thank you so much again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right.
All right.
Episode 6. Bucks.